Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, July 23rd, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. An American surgeon says IDF snipers are shooting toddlers. So an American surgeon who volunteered in Gaza told CBS Sunday Morning in an interview that aired Sunday that Israeli snipers were purposely shooting Palestinian children, including toddlers. So this is Dr. Mark Perlmutter, and he said that he was in Gaza at the end of April and in the first couple of weeks of May. He said, quote, "I had children who were shot twice. I have two children that I have photographs of that were shot so perfectly in the chest, I couldn't put my stethoscope over their heart more accurately, and directly on the side of the head in the same child. No toddler gets shot twice by mistake by the world's best snipers, and they're dead center shots," end quote. And when he said the world's best snipers, he did like air quotes talking about the IDF. So we've heard similar accounts. Other foreign doctors who volunteered in Gaza gave a similar account to The Guardian back in April, saying that Israeli snipers were shooting children in the head. This is something that has happened before. You know, the protests at the Gaza wall in 2018 and 2019, known as the Great March of Return. Some children were killed in those by IDF snipers. There's been other cases in the West Bank, but never at this scale of what's happening in Gaza. And earlier this month, there was that big report from 972 magazine, which is an Israeli outlet, that detailed how the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, in Gaza essentially had no restrictions on who they could shoot. And this report cited Israeli soldiers, that those were the sources. And the report said that the IDF routinely executes civilians who enter areas the military deemed no-go zones, and it detailed shootings where young children were killed. So in his interview, Perlmutter, who's the vice president of the International College of Surgeons, said what he saw in Gaza was worse than all of the disaster zones he's seen combined. And he's volunteered to do a lot of work around the world. He said, quote, 40 mission trips, 30 years, ground zero, earthquakes, all of that combined does not equal the level of carnage that I saw against civilians in just my first week in Gaza, end quote. And then he was asked if the civilians that he saw wounded or killed were mostly children. He said, quote, almost exclusively children. I've never seen that before. Never seen that. I've seen more incinerated children than I've ever seen in my entire life combined. I've seen more shredded children in just the first week, end quote. So then he was asked what he meant by shredded children, and he said, quote, missing body parts, being crushed by buildings, the greatest majority, or bomb explosions, the next greatest majority. We've taken shrapnel as big as my thumb out of 8-year-olds, end quote. Remember, this guy was in Gaza for like 3 weeks, and this is what he saw on a large scale in just one Gaza hospital. And he was the one actually I mentioned yesterday. We had one story that was written by 2 surgeons who volunteered in Gaza. He was one of the authors of that. I mean, the accounts that we see from these hospitals, the pictures and videos that we see coming out of these hospitals are, you know, this stuff of nightmares. And according to Gaza's health ministry, nearly 16,000 children have been killed by the Israeli assault on Gaza, and about 38,000 have been wounded. And many of them are amputees. Many of them had to get limbs cut off without anesthetics. Again, just nightmare, complete horror show, and it goes on, and the U.S. keeps supporting this. All right, so the next one here, Israel launches new assault on Khan Younis, kills 70 Palestinians. So on Monday, the Israeli military launched a new assault on the southern Gaza city of Khan Younis and ordered the evacuation of an area where 400,000 Palestinians were sheltering. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, a heavy assault began almost immediately after the evacuation order, giving Palestinians on the ground no time to prepare and forcing them to flee under fire. So apparently they dropped the leaflets, and just right after that, they started this big assault here. And Gaza's health ministry said that Israeli air and ground assaults killed at least 70 Palestinians and wounded more than 200. You see the picture here of a family fleeing, a woman in a wheelchair being, rolled along, and a young woman walking with what looks like her walker. Just, these are the people getting displaced over and over again. And part of this evacuation order applied to one of these so-called safe zones. So these are people that have been displaced multiple times. You see interviews, they say this is our 7th, 8th time being moved. There's some people who have been displaced up to 10 times already. And the ministry said that the dead included women and children. They didn't have a number. And the IDF evacuation order, again, I said that already, that it covered safe zones. And just about the scale of the displacement in Gaza. The population of Gaza before October 7th was about 2.3 million, 2.2 million. You see kind of different estimates hovering around there. And speaking of children, it's over 1 million children are included in that population. So any bombing campaign, any sort of military operation against this territory that's very densely populated and has so many kids, it's going to kill so many children. And of course, that's what we're seeing. But according to the UN, about 1.9 million Palestinians, or 9 in 10 people, have been internally displaced in Gaza. And another thing, on Monday, Gaza's health ministry said that the death toll has crossed 39,000, and that number is considered a low estimate since it does not account for the estimated 10,000 people who are missing and presumed dead under the rubble. And then others have died due to malnutrition, disease, and other health complications caused by the siege. We don't know, I don't know on what scale that is at this point. All right, so the next one here, Israel bombs a tent of journalists. This one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The Israeli Defense Forces dropped a bomb on a tent sheltering journalists covering the situation at the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital. On Monday, journalist Haidar Ibrahim al-Massadar was killed and several others experienced serious injuries when an Israeli munition hit a tent near the hospital in central Gaza. One of the rescue workers told Middle East Eye that all the contents in the tent were journalistic equipment, cameras, and things like that. So according to Gaza's media office, this is the 163rd journalist killed by Israel in Gaza over the past 9 months. So that is a rate of over 4 reporters per week. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu arrives in Washington. So on Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu arrived in the U.S., where he is scheduled to address a joint session of Congress. Netanyahu's visit comes amid political turmoil in the U.S. as President Biden announced on Sunday that he was dropping out of the presidential race and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. It's been so strange. The announcement was a statement issued on Twitter. I don't think it was issued anywhere else. It was just kind of a screenshot of a statement. And Biden hasn't made a public appearance since then. And now Biden was supposed to host Netanyahu at the White House on Tuesday, but an Israeli source told the Times of Israel that the meeting might not happen because the president is still sick with COVID-19. So he's got COVID still, apparently. So, we'll see. And then there's reports he's trying to get a meeting with Trump. I think Kamala Harris is going to be out of town during his visit. Netanyahu's visit comes as he has been sabotaging the chances of reaching a ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas, a fact widely acknowledged by Israeli officials and media outlets. Even the Israeli security and military establishment has been pushing for Netanyahu to agree to a deal. And we have the U.S. claiming that it's been pushing for a ceasefire, but they have refused to condemn Netanyahu's actions. You see in the press conferences when they asked the State Department about all this stuff, all the hostage deal stuff, Netanyahu sabotaging it, they say, we don't want to get into the negotiations from here. You can see why. We don't want to talk about it publicly. But then when it's, Hamas making demands, then they're all, just blaming everything on Hamas. And even when you had Israel, Netanyahu outright rejecting this big plan that Biden came out with, they were still blaming it on Hamas. But now they're just taking we don't want to negotiate from the podium, that they say things like that. And then before departing Israel, Netanyahu said that Israel would be a strong ally of the U.S. regardless of who is in charge in Washington. He said, quote, "I will tell my friends on both sides of the aisle that regardless who the American people choose as their next president, Israel remains America's indispensable and strong ally in the Middle East. In this time of war and uncertainty, it's important that Israel's enemies know that America and Israel stand together today, tomorrow, and always," end quote. So we'll see who he meets with. All right, the next one here. Israel confirms the death of 2 more Israeli hostages in Gaza. So the Israeli military announced on Monday that it confirmed the deaths of 2 more Israeli hostages inside Gaza and said the possibility that they were killed by Israeli military fire is being investigated. They told the families of Yegev Bushtov, who's a 35-year-old, and Alex Danzig, a 75-year-old, that they both died several months ago. Both men were taken captive by Hamas during the October 7th attack on southern Israel. According to Al Jazeera, Hamas announced their deaths back in March. The Palestinian group said that Danzig was killed by Israeli military fire, while Bushtov died due to the lack of food and medicine. The Times of Israel reported that the news of the IDF confirming these deaths means that 44 out of the 116 Israeli hostages remaining in Gaza are dead. The total is likely higher. Israeli officials estimated back in March that they thought only 60 to 70 hostages were still alive. And that was Israeli officials speaking to Haaretz, anonymously. It wasn't like an official estimate, but again, that's all the way back in March. And this is why internally people are getting very angry at Netanyahu in Israel for not agreeing to a deal while you have these hostages. They keep dying. And relatives of these 2 men said that they could have been saved if the Israeli government reached a deal with Hamas. And some had harsh words for the Israeli prime minister, who has been sabotaging the negotiations. So this is Matti Danzig, the son of Alex. He said, quote, "Dad didn't just die. He died for the sake of Netanyahu's government of destruction," end quote. He said Netanyahu is sabotaging the deal and is choosing to save his government rather than the lives of the Israeli hostages. He said, quote, "The sacrificing of the hostages out of political motives is a much, much greater failure than the failure of October 7th. This isn't just criminal negligence. It is full-on treason," end quote. And so there was also family members of the 8 Israeli American hostages who are being held in Gaza. They're also calling for a hostage deal. They kind of put on they didn't put out a joint statement, but they did like a press conference, all of them, saying Netanyahu's got to agree to a deal. And one of them said, quote, "We are at a point now where the defense establishment in Israel, the intelligence community, the negotiating team, and increasingly the public, as shown by polling, are saying we must do a deal now to bring home the hostages," end quote. And again, he says the defense establishment, the intelligence community, the negotiating team, everybody except for Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and maybe some other members of the government, and I'm sure that there's other members of the Knesset, but the overwhelming Israeli establishment favors a hostage deal with Hamas at this time. And unfortunately, they say that we could restart military operations. They don't want a permanent ceasefire. But even Netanyahu doesn't want that right now. All right, so the next one here, UNICEF reports surge in child casualties in the West Bank. This article is from The Cradle. In a report published on July 22nd, UNICEF indicated a 250% increase in the number of children killed in the occupied West Bank since Israel's genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip began on October 7th, 2023. UNICEF reports that 143 Palestinian children have been killed in the West Bank since October, compared to 41 children killed in the 9-month period preceding it. Additionally, it found more than 440 Palestinian children have been injured by live ammunition and estimated that one child has been targeted and killed by Israeli soldiers every 2 days in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. The UNICEF said, quote, "The figures raise serious alarm around unnecessary and excessive use of force against the most vulnerable," end quote. So this is just part of the overall violence in the West Bank as well. I believe the death toll now of Palestinians in the West Bank since October 7th is about 550. All right, the next one here, looking at Kamala Harris's record on Israel. So this is from Mondo Weiss. They put together, some stuff about Harris and her support for Israel. And really, she's always been a staunch supporter of Israel, very favorable of Israel. There's been some people saying, she gave a speech a few months ago, and she said, "That's why I'm calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza," and everybody cheered. And then while everybody was cheering, she said, "For 6 weeks." She wasn't calling for a real end to this thing, basically calling for at the time, the hostage deal that was on the table to be implemented. So I'll just read a bit of this, just get into some things that she has said in recent years about Israel. Vice President Kamala Harris has emerged as the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination after Joe Biden dropped out. Harris has been a staunch supporter of Israel for years. In 2017, she addressed the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, their annual conference, and reminded attendees that the first resolution she co-sponsored as a senator was aimed at combating anti-Israel bias at the United Nations. She said, quote, "Let me be clear about what I believe. I stand with Israel because of our shared values, which are so fundamental to the founding of both our nations," end quote. So she sounds like Mike Johnson there. It's this supporting Israel is fundamental to the founding of the United States. Doesn't make any sense. In 2018, she gave an off-the-record speech to the organization, but eventually released her comments. In that speech, she claimed that she raised money for the Jewish National Fund as a Girl Scout. And while running for president in 2019, Harris was praised by the lobbying group Democratic Majority for Israel for running to the right of Obama on the Iran deal. So she was against the Iran deal, said that it needed to be strengthened, basically said the stuff that the Trump administration was saying, and Biden eventually, I think, adopted these talking points as well. Harris has condemned the BDS movement and claimed that it is based on the mistaken assumption that Israel is solely to blame for the conflict. She did vote against an anti-BDS bill in 2019, citing First Amendment concerns. And then lately, it gets into what she has been saying about October 7th, of course, saying Israel, expressing strong support for Israel having the right to defend itself. She also said some things about, she's showed some sympathy for Palestinians in Gaza, but of course that means nothing when you're part of a government that is helping, genocide them. So one thing that Democrats seem to care about is optics when it comes to this thing, and they don't actually care about the people being killed and slaughtered and the supporting Israel as it is doing everything it can to impede any sort of peace. So I think we're gonna just see more. If she becomes president, I think we'll see more of the same that we've seen. Basically the same thing Biden's been doing. All right, so the next one here: German officials are at odds over U.S. missiles. So members of Germany's ruling coalition government are at odds with each other over a U.S. plan to deploy missile systems to the country in 2026. That were previously banned by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the U.S. withdrew from in 2019. The plan was announced in a joint statement released by the U.S. and Germany during the NATO summit earlier this month, but some German officials said they were caught off guard or denounced the plan as an unnecessary escalation, including members of the Social Democratic Party, which is the party of Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So Rolf Mutzenich, probably pronouncing that wrong. I'm bad with German names. He's the parliamentary leader of the SDP, He warned that the danger of an unintentional military escalation is considerable, and Russian officials have said that they're not ruling out deploying new nuclear missiles in response. The announcement said the U.S. would deploy land-based nuclear-capable Tomahawk missiles, SM-6 missiles, and developmental hypersonic weapons. As I've gone over a lot, the Tomahawks were banned by the INF because of the land-based version of them. They have been used on U.S. Navy destroyers and submarines, but the land-based version was banned by this treaty, but no more since the U.S. pulled out of it. So this is a huge escalation. This planned missile deployment. Obviously, you've seen the big reaction from Russia. I thought this was interesting because there's a lot of members, again, of the coalition government who are saying, like, hold on a second, what are we doing here? Ralph Stenger, another member of the SDB in the German parliament, also warned against the deployment. He said, quote, "This will not make the world safer. On the contrary, we are entering a spiral in which the world is becoming increasingly dangerous." And quote, Sarah Nanny, a member of the Greens, which is part of the coalition government, she denounced the plan, said, quote, "It can increase fears and leaves room for disinformation and incitement," end quote. So on Sunday, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who's also a member of the Greens, responded to the criticism from within her own party and government, saying the U.S. missiles were welcome. She said, quote, "We must protect ourselves and our Baltic partners against this, including through increased deterrence and additional standoff weapons," end quote. And the this she's referring to there, I guess, is Russia. Germany's leading opposition party, the Christian Democrats, they are in favor of the U.S. deployment, while other opposition parties, including the Alternative for Germany and the Left Party, have come out against it. So maybe... hopefully, there's some more dissent from within the German government about this plan, and they rethink it. All right, so the next one here, the EU boycotts Hungary's EU presidency over Orban's peace mission. So Josep Borrell, the European Union's top foreign policy official, has taken a step to effectively boycott Hungary's rotating presidency of the EU in response to Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's recent efforts to pursue peace in Ukraine. Hungary was scheduled to host a meeting of EU foreign ministers in August, but Borrell said the meeting will now be held in Brussels. He said, quote, "We have to send a signal even if it is a symbolic signal," end quote. EU officials have been fuming over Orban's recent trips to Moscow and Beijing to discuss the prospect of peace in Ukraine, which came after he met with Zelensky, so he also went to Kiev. Borrell and other officials took particular offense at Orban labeling the EU's policies toward Ukraine pro-war. Most European and NATO countries have discouraged the idea of peace talks and favor sending more weapons into the conflict zone. So if you're against negotiations, you want to keep sending weapons, I think pro-war is a fair way to describe you. Borrell said, quote, "If you want to talk about the war party, talk about Putin," end quote. So amid Orban's push for peace, there are signs that Zelensky is reconsidering his policy of not negotiating with Russia. He recently suggested that Russian officials should attend the next international summit on the war that he is organizing. All right, so the next one here, Iraq wants the U.S. to start drawing down troops. So the Iraqi government wants the U.S. to begin drawing down the number of troops it has in the country starting this September. This was reported by Reuters on Monday, citing Iraqi sources. The sources said that Baghdad wants the U.S.-led anti-ISIS coalition to formally end its work by September 2025. So they want it to start in September and finish in September 2025. But they did say that some U.S. troops will likely remain in a different capacity. The U.S. currently has 2,500 U.S. troops in Iraq, and a big part of this is that the U.S. troops in Iraq support the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria. That means if the U.S. fully withdraws from Iraq, they would have to get out of Syria too, and they do not want to do that. So there's no formal agreement here. This is just what Iraq is thinking. U.S. and Iraqi officials are meeting this week to discuss it. Any agreement that leaves U.S. troops in Iraq could lead to more attacks on U.S. bases by the Iraqi Shia militias, as they have been pressuring Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani to expel U.S. forces. Al-Sudani began calling for the U.S. to withdraw after Biden began launching airstrikes in Iraq against the Shia militias that fall under the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is an umbrella group of militias that are part of Iraq's security forces. So they're part of the Iraqi military. The U.S. was bombing them in response to these rocket attacks, and they weren't, apparently they didn't give Iraq any heads up. Actually, I shouldn't say apparently, we know that they didn't give Iraq any heads up, because there was at one point the White House claimed that they gave Baghdad notice, and then they came out and had to retract that because they didn't. So this is your supposed partner. This is the U.S.'s supposed partner in the country, is the Iraqi government, and they're bombing their security forces and not telling them about it. So, and al-Sudani has said that Iraqi forces could handle the ISIS remnants in the country without the U.S.-led coalition. The U.S. and Iraq entered talks on the issue, but there's been no sign of progress yet. So hopefully this leads to something. And then, one really important thing to understand about Iraq, if they want the U.S. to leave, why aren't they leaving? If you remember back in 2020 when the U.S. killed Soleimani in Baghdad, the Iranian general, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel the U.S., but the U.S. didn't go anywhere. And the big thing that the U.S. has, the leverage, is they have the ability to destroy Iraq's economy. Since the 2003 invasion, Iraq's foreign reserves have been held by the U.S. Federal Reserve. That means Washington basically has control over Baghdad's dollar supply and the ability to devalue the Iraqi dinar. And recently, not that long ago, they were devaluing the Iraqi currency because because of this trade that was going on between Iraq and Iran. Apparently, it was some black market stuff, and the U.S. said they didn't like it, and they started to hurt the Iraqi their currency, the dinar. And there was protests about this. Iraqis came out protesting this, and they had signs that showed the Federal Reserve with a big X over it. So American libertarians might have more in common with Iraqis than they think. Both not too fond of the U.S. Federal Reserve. And the U.S. also keeps tight control over Iraq's ability to pay Iran for much-needed electricity. That's something you see. The Iran hawks say, oh, Biden's giving another $1 billion to Iran. But what that is the U.S. allowing Iraq to pay its electricity bill. And it's just complete, the fact that the U.S. has control over, two neighboring countries, exporting a resource like electricity. I mean, it's just, it's absurd. So this is what they have over them. And that's why al-Sudani isn't like saying, no, you have to go now. He still has to be careful, even though it's in his interest to get the U.S. out. All right, so the last story here, Taiwan starts war games with live fire drills near China. So this one is from the South China Morning Post. So Taiwan has kicked off their annual big war games, and these are the first under President William Lai. And so one thing they're saying is that this is the first time ever that they're not going to do rehearsed war games. They're going to try to mimic actual combat with having scenarios that they don't know what is going to happen. And then the other thing is that they're doing live fire drills near Kinmen or on Kinmen, the islands that Taiwan controls right on the coast of mainland China. So they're going to do live fire drills there. I'm not sure what the scale is. This story doesn't really say how big those live fire drills are going to be. But those are the islands where we learned this year that there's U.S. troops there, that there's U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets there for training. We don't know exactly how many, but this has been confirmed by Taiwan. Which, I mean, again, the parts of these islands are 2.5 miles off the coast of mainland China. In the event of any war, big war over Taiwan, the first thing China's probably going to do is take those islands or really bomb them heavily. And there's U.S. troops there. So just something to keep an eye on, these big drills, just kind of the tensions around that area. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Daniel Larison, Houthis only emboldened by Israeli attacks. One from Ted Snyder, deflating Biden's boast on NATO. One from Kelly Vlahos, U.S. general wants Marshall Plan to counter China in Latin America. One from Vijay Prashad, NATO accelerates its conflict with China. One from Doug Bandow, South Korea must grow up and defend itself. Another thing I want to mention is the Ron Paul Institute's event, the Liberty Platform. It is August 31st in Washington, D.C. at the Hilton Washington Dulles Airport. I'm going to be there. I'll be speaking at the student conference, which is the day before. If there's any students that listen to this, the deadline to apply for that is August 1st. If you apply and you get accepted, it's free of charge, and they, you don't have to pay anything to go to the student conference, which I'll be speaking at, and so will Judge Andrew Napolitano. He'll be speaking at the student conference as well. And then the main conference on Saturday, we have John Mearsheimer, Ron Paul, Dan McAdams, Joel Salatin, if people are familiar with him. It looks like Jeff Deist is speaking now, former Mises Institute president. That's very cool. Dr. Joseph Mercola, Judge Knapp again, he's going to be at the main conference. So it's going to be a good time. And I'll be there staying at the hotel. So let me know if you're going to go. Tickets are $85. It's totally worth it. I went 1 year. I didn't go last year because my son was born like the same weekend. But I went the year before, and it's just really fun. Totally worth the money. All right, so that is it for me for today. I will try to remember to put the link to that actually in the description. That's something I've been forgetting to do. But anyway, you want to support this show, share it, tell your friends about antiwar.com, like, subscribe, share, all that stuff. Follow us on social media. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.